Hey guys, this is Draco with Legends in Our Free Time, bringing you my second chess game against 7thSense. So obviously this is round 2 to a video that's already been posted, and this time I was playing black. He's playing white obviously, so he plays first move. He plays e4, seems everyone likes this move, except I respond differently since I play c5, signalling that I'm playing the Sicilian defense. I won't be going into an analysis of how this defense initially works, since this is not a video on chess openings, but this is a very standard defense played by black too, as a response to white's e5 opening move, e4 opening move, sorry, trust me. He backs up with knight f3, which is a standard development move, and I back up the extended pawn I have with d6. This is again very standard stuff, and you'll see here there's a little bit of a hole which he immediately exploits with a immediate bishop to b5 check, which is a bookline in the Sicilian, and it's possibly at this point a little bit of a premature attack, since I can just very easily block it with knight c6 like I do here, and he goes for an immediate exchange, so down a minor piece each. But after he castles here, I mean, he has castled early, so he's got a nice early defense going, but after e5, I have a much better central presence than he does at the minute, since he only has one pawn forward and one developed. I mean, I've got no pieces developed at the minute, but he isn't staking so much of a claim to the center as of yet, so he needs to start working on that, which he does a little bit with knight c3, just getting another piece involved in the action. I follow suit with knight f6, and he plays d3 to hold his pawn in place, since it's not exactly being threatened at the minute, since I can't really go in and capture it with my knight, since he would just immediately recapture with his knight, but it does free the diagonal for the bishop to use as well. I play here h6, which the purpose of this move mostly was to prevent him playing bishop g5 to pin my knight to my queen. It's just a slight shame that if I was intending to castle a couple of moves later, this would result in a slightly decreased king safety level, because, you know, my pawn structure is disturbed a little bit. He plays just a symmetrical move here, so I'm guessing he was thinking the exact same thing, because my bishop can also come down and put a pin on his knight in the line of his queen, so that prevents both of those. g6 here, again slightly weakening the pawn formation around the king if I ever decide to castle, but it does prepare bishop g7, which is getting as close to the dragon variation of the Sicilian defense as I can, which is a very sharp tactical line that's meant to be used very aggressively, which I fancy, since although I'm not as well read up on opening theory as other people, I don't generally like playing black, so I don't like being put on the defensive as usually happens, since white generally sets the initiative. He plays g4 here to get a little bit of a kingside thrust, but I'm not entirely sure about this. I mean, sure, I can't recapture immediately with the knight, but I'm not sure about this one. I mean, he's really compromising his king's position, really. And like I say, I just continue bishop g7, so standard. We're still just building up a position in general. King g2, getting it on a light square, and I mean, I guess he is supporting the h-pawn, because as it is, his h-pawn, if he hadn't moved his king, it would be entirely hanging, and it would really be asking for something to invade. But this position is starting to look quite cramped, and I was thinking, you know, I've got to do something about this. Plus, with the really shoddy kingside defense that's going on, I could really try and exploit this. But I end up going about it the wrong way, because I make a move which, I mean, at the time I thought it had some power, but in hindsight I really should have gone for something better, because I play h5 thinking, okay, I'm going to be inviting an exchange here, because he can capture my pawn, and I can then come in with my knight or my rook or anything. I can basically just exploit the fact that there's very little in the way of that file being defended. But instead he just pushes his pawn even more, forcing me to kick my knight off. and I didn't see that, and at this point I decided to actually sacrifice my knight by pushing it further into his territory with knight g4, which pretty much, I mean, as you can see, I'm definitely inviting the recapture here with h captures g4, and yes, I know. So I'm down a piece by this point, but I was like, oh crap, that was kind of not bad, not good. But I line up a little bit of some counterplay here with queen d7, which obviously it's threatening a diagonal attack since the queen is supported by the bishop. So even if I moved the queen and moved it directly next to the king can't recapture. So that's a very immediate threat, which he immediately addresses with knight h2, providing some support to the pawn. And this knight, for quite a lot of the game to come, proves to be a real thorn in my side, since it really cramps the position. Since, well, you'll see here, h captures g4 again. And everything's getting quite closed up here, since as you can see on the E file, the pawns aren't going anywhere since they're locked together. Same on the G file. It's a mess, and it only gets worse, trust me. He brings his rook over to h1. I'm guessing that he's thinking that he can have an uncovered attack at any point if he moves his knight, but I didn't particularly like this move from him. I decide just to push my g-pawn, since it's obviously inviting him to recapture with his pawn again, but he's really not going anywhere in terms of his own development at this point. All of his moves at this point are passive and defensive, just to hold his king side together. Queen h3 check it's more of a spite check than anything, I suppose, since obviously he can't recapture, like I say, because I'm supported both by my rook and my bishop, but he can't really go many places, and I'm basically just trying to shift him around to a slightly worse position. And at this point there's really nothing else I can do with this queen other than move it back to d7. In fact, this move's kind of forced, because I believe if I'd left the queen there and just done a move any other way, I think if he then on his next move had played knight to g4, I think my queen would have been lost, because had that happened, there's not a single space that I could have moved to save my queen, since the knight would then be blocking my big escape route, and every square that my queen can move to after knight g4 is guarded by some piece or another. So this was pretty much a forced move to get my queen out of trouble, and in hindsight it might have been a bit of a waste of a tempo. He then pushes his pawn up, and there's really nothing that can be done with the king side at this point, because the position's really getting sealed up with the pawns not being able to attack each other and blocking friendly progress. Obviously I can't move through my black pawns, he can't move through his white pawns, so it's really cramping the abilities of both our bishops and our queens to move around freely. And I've decided at this point this really isn't going anywhere, and we really need to start opening the position a little bit. So I try for a little central push. I was thinking if he decides to recapture here with ext5, I really wouldn't mind that much, since I could recapture with my c pawn and I'd still have a strong pawn center, as well as being backed up by the queen. But he decides not to. He just moves his king off again. So I decide, yeah, I'm just going to make things even more complicated by sealing both of the middle files, so that the position is just getting more and more closed as it goes. And what with his king being so exposed here, because his king really has nothing in the way of defenders at the minute. Ironically, although I'm uncastled, my king is actually safer than his is, since, you know, looking at the position, there's absolutely no way that he's getting through to my back rank at the minute. So my king can basically just sit there uncastled, and I can not have to worry about any assaults on my king definitely for the time being. As well as the fact that if he ever tries to move his rook on h to capture my rook or something like that, there's my bishop sitting on g7, just providing a little bit of backward support for it. So we were both at this point quite confused as to how we were going to make any progress here. And I decided that I would have to break the tension by really opening up the center if we were ever going to get anywhere. He plays knight e2, and the next couple of moves here, he's basically just trying to consolidate his kingside and provide a little bit more of a solid position. But all this really does is give me a couple of free turns to further my plan. And at this point, I was thinking I need to do something with castling, since I also want to have a pair of connected rooks, which really, really helps me later in the game. And I can do this at the same time by setting up a queenside castle rather than a kingside castle. I think at this point a kingside castle would be extremely weak, since the rook on the open H file is extremely powerful, and obviously if I castle I lose that right away. So I decided instead I want to be queenside castling. If I'm going to do that, I need to get the bishop out of the way, and I want to put the bishop where the queen is because I want to still have control of this long diagonal rather than kick the bishop off to b7 or a6. I don't really want to control any of those diagonals, considering how closed the position is if I put it on B, and it's not really going anywhere if I put it on A. So I start doing this by queen e6, so I'm still on the long diagonal, and obviously you can see that bishop d7 is coming next. Again, he just moves his knight, I move my bishop. So I've still got control of the long diagonal, plus I'm ready to castle queenside whenever I want, which also, coincidentally, the place that the rook is going to end up, it's going to be right behind the bishop, it's going to be bearing down on a central file, it's just going to be in a really powerful and dangerous position for providing some support. He plays bishop d2 here. I suppose he's controlling more of the queen side, and he's threatening that he could just abuse that at any point, but I'm not entirely sure what this accomplishes. And although the game is pretty boring and protracted so far, it really gets a lot more tactical later on, so don't worry, things are going to pick up right about now actually, since I push with c4, and something really has to start happening now. There really needs to be some sort of counterplay to try and stop me from really pushing too far with pawns, since extended pawns are just extremely dangerous. He recaptures, but this doesn't provide so much of a defense, since I can immediately recapture with my queen, and suddenly it looks like I'm gonna have some more positions to play with on the queen side to play with some more checks, since, you know, his king is on the 3rd rank, and that's a pretty open rank for me to use as long as I can avoid those queenside pawns, which he does for me quite nicely, since he plays c3, which I think is, I'm not gonna lie, that I do not understand at all why he was doing that, since all he's doing here is, I mean, sure, he's opening a path for his queen to use, but he's also blocking off most of the space that his bishop can use. Plus, all it's doing is inviting me to come in with queen d3 check. And I'm really threatening to completely overrun any sort of defenses that he can hold at this point, since there's not too many places he can run to. Obviously, I'm controlling the H file, so that's completely out of the question for him to go to. And he just plays king f2 to get out of the way. I get a free pawn out of this, since I can just capture, and suddenly the center is looking a lot more open, since there's nothing obstructing where my pawns can go now. Obviously, he can capture my d pawn with his c pawn, but I can immediately capture with e, or I can then put back in check with recapturing with my queen, so he doesn't do any of that. And as you can see right here, I'm also threatening his rook at the same time. My pawn recapture is threatening his rook, and there's nowhere for his rook to go, so he needs to defend with a piece. So he does this quite nicely with knight, his G knight, as opposed to his H knight, which is extremely important, since it's a little variation I can show here, where if he had instead used his H knight, obviously it's just uncovering my rook to come in and swallow up his rook because it's uncovered. So that was definitely the best of the moves he could have done for knight defense. He chose wisely out of the 2 knights available. But I was going back to where we actually did got to. This is the point where I did decide to queenside castle, and I don't think he expected it, since I mean move 25. Normally, castling for both sides normally happens within the first 10 moves of a game, so I really don't think this was expected, and this is definitely powerful in that it gives me connected rooks and a far greater presence in the centre. I mean, the queenside presence in general is minimal at best. There's no activity going on the queen side at all, so I don't mind putting my king over there, even though he's incredibly exposed. He could have found some counterplay, I guess, by moving his queen to a4 and then moving it down to a6 just to force a check, but I'm really not sure what else he can do with this position. And just to show another variation, had I chosen to kingside castle instead, I mean, as you can see, all I'm doing is weakening my kingside activity, because like I say, I want to keep the rook on the h-file. All I'm doing is moving it away. Now he can move a couple of his pieces around, but in general I lose control of one of the most vital files, so that would have been really bad overall had that happened. cxd4, exd4, like I said, that was coming at some point, but I still have quite a nicely extended pawn, and as long as that bishop is staying on g7, it's really threatening anything that decides to try and come in and take care of that pawn, so that's not happening anytime soon. He loses a tempo with bishop c1 here because, you know, he moved his bishop there earlier, now he's just moving it back. It does uncover the line for the queen to use, since the queen is now threatening the pawn, but as I say, as long as the pawn's got defenders, he's not doing anything to that pawn. So I really don't mind about that. And here I decide that I'm going to start trying to do something with my dark square bishop, as opposed to just defending extended pawns, because I can see a little bit of a tactical idea coming here to try and push my pawn a little bit more without any cost to it. So I play bishop f8, and you can probably see that what I'm threatening next is bishop to c5, putting it directly behind the pawn and in line with the king, so that if I ever move the pawn, he cannot immediately recapture the pawn since he's in check from a discovered attack from the bishop, and then he has to address that first. Plus, if I ever move the light square bishop anywhere, the rook that I castled with is also still holding down the pawn. So I really like how much pressure this central pawn is putting on his position at this point. He plays queen g1 here. Personally, I think this is quite a weak move, especially since it makes things a lot worse for him, considering the uncovered check I said I was going to exploit later. Because obviously, if I use the check and then he just moves the king just to get out of it, he immediately loses the queen, since I can just go in with the bishop. And I do have a variation showing that in a little bit, so you will see. He sees this coming a mile off and just prevents it with king g2, since, you know, like I say, it would be really bad for him if he had to move out of check to get out of that. And the variation to show how that could have happened, just say he moved his bishop back again. I then move the pawn down. Oh no, he's in check, he's got to move. So king g2, which he should have done a move earlier. Bishop captures g1, rook recaptures, but again, he's just down a queen, and I would consider this to be a resignable position, to be quite honest. And possibly here, the move, well, this really is the beginning of the end, and is possibly the move of the game in terms of how much it serves my purpose of really cracking what's left of his defense. Bishop x g4, which I may be flattering myself a little that I annotated with 2 exclamation points, but come on, give me a break. This really smashes open any defense that he has left, because it results, obviously it results in knight recapture, and I cannot safely go in and capture his rook with mine since his queen can immediately recapture. And I thought about my sequence of moves here for a long time before I decided how to continue here, but I decided that it was good to play queen captures g4. Well, sorry, there's variation here showing what would have happened had I done the rook move. So obviously queen recaptures, queen captures there, and we're still equal in material. Plus, I don't really like how his queen is in a position to, you know, still defend the king and such. But the point being that we're still equal in material, as opposed to me gaining a winning position from that. And a second variation that I saw from that point was that if he'd instead moved his king there, there's a continuation of moves in the form of rook coming down h8, and the only conceivable way he can defend that is moving his knight in the way, and after the rook recaptures, that's checkmate. So that would have cut the game short a little there had he chosen the wrong space to move, showing just how much you really have to know king safety and endgame skills to be able to survive a series of checks and not get yourself mated early. But back to the main line, after the queen captures the knight, he only has two squares to go to, king f2 and king f1, and he makes the most of it by going to the better of the two, which is king f2. We can show this because had he gone to king f1, this loses the game incredibly quickly with queen captures at f3. If he defends with the queen, then I can just come in with the rook and that's checkmate instantly. So that would have been a very, very quickly losing position for him. So at this point, although he's really struggling to hold any sort of defense together, he is doing incredibly well at this point to avoid unnecessary checkmates. So I have to give him credit for how well he was able to hold what's left of his defense. And at this point, this is where I use the uncovered check, basically to give myself another turn of being able to keep my queen and rook in the positions that they are, because as you can see, both the rooks and the queens are in a position to come in and capture each other. But I like where they're sitting currently, and I really want to avoid having to move them if possible. And the best way to do this is simply to keep forcing checks so that he can't come in and capture. And at this point, obviously with the king being threatened here, the only place that he can go is moving into the open e file, since my queen is covering the g file. Oh no, sorry. He brings in his bishop to block my assault, and he basically forces an exchange of bishops here, which is fine because it still results in my rook coming over, which, remember, would not have been possible had I not done queenside castle before, so that proved to be extremely important. And there's very, very few options left at this point. I mean, Jesus, man, there's nothing going for him, really. King f2. Personally, I didn't like this. I think he could have chosen to either go there or he could have gone the other way, and I think he would have lasted a couple more moves and forced me to run out of checks had I gone the other way. Plus, then obviously if I run out of checks, he's then free to start capturing my queen and rook. So at this point my thought process was just keep forcing checks, don't let up the assault, keep him on the defensive. The variation here showing that had he gone king d2, rook can come down covered by the pawn and force him more towards that side, but after the queen forces another check with a4, he can simply defend very quickly with b3, and then I am out of checks to force, and it's like, damn, now I have to move my queen just to keep it alive, and then he's free to come down the h-file with his rook, and then he's starting to put me in check. So I really didn't want to give him any chances for any counterplay like that, not to mention where his queen is. It's got a very nice diagonal to come in and exploit my pawn there, and it really basically wasn't looking good for me if I had been forced into this position. Another thing that could have happened from this king d2 position is had I instead forced check with the queen, there would have been a little bit of a run around with him basically just avoiding me, but I can't really see again how I would have forced more and more checks. So the best I could have achieved here, I think, is a perpetual check, which would have resulted in a draw. So again, showing that had he gone in this direction as opposed to this direction, although it's not perhaps flat out winning for him, it's at least preventing a loss. And really, I mean, is that... Oh yeah, that's just the variation again, sorry. So after he goes back to the main line, after he does move his king to f2, which is what he does in the game, the rook can come down to e2 like he did before, except with the difference that from this position, the only place that the king can go to escape is f1. And it's a very simple forced continuation from here, with the queen checking on f3. And after the queen defends with f2, it's simply queen recaptures f2 and checkmate. And alternatively, I could have come in with my rook to capture his rook, which again would have been mate. So as you can see, by that point there was really nothing to do. I would say again, it goes back to that position where my bishop really comes in, sacrifices itself to open up the position a little bit, since, you know, oh, I'm just going to recapture that piece, oh no, I'm in check, I've got to move. And then from that point, it's just a series of perpetual moves to keep himself alive, and there's simply nothing he can do from that point. The game is completely over from that point, and I was so glad to be able to find that, since I was really sweating when the position was getting closed up in the middle game, and I'm just really glad that the game went the way it did. So that was really good, 7thSense, MkWii17, and I know that we're having another game at the minute, so it's currently a draw and 1 win to me, so you need to flat out win this one if we're going to equalise. So I'm going to wait to see if you do, and I hope you guys enjoy the video. See you later.